A billionaire thought he could buy the royal guard's respect, tossing stacks of $100 bills at him as if dignity had a price. But with one powerful, unmoving gesture, the guard silenced the crowd, and in an instant, the billionaire's wealth meant nothing. This is how his pride unraveled. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe and give the video a like. Let's get started. There are moments in life that stick with you forever. Moments that change how you see the world. What happened outside Buckingham Palace on that chilly October morning was one of those moments. I'd been walking past the palace gates, just another face in the crowd of tourists and locals starting their day, when I witnessed something that would make headlines around the globe. The morning had that perfect autumn crispness that makes London shine. Tour groups clustered around the famous Red Guards, cameras clicking away as they tried to capture the perfect shot of these stoic sentinels. The usual carnival atmosphere surrounded the palace. Vendors hawking souvenirs, children pressing against the railings, tourists consulting their maps and guidebooks. Then came the sound that shattered the peaceful morning routine. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom came roaring down the street, its engine note aggressive and demanding. The car didn't glide to a stop like you'd expect from such a refined vehicle. It lurched to a halt right in front of the gates, blocking traffic without any regard for the chaos it was causing. Out stepped a man who commanded attention simply by existing. This was Max Sterling III, though I didn't know his name at the time. What I did know was that everything about him screamed wealth and privilege. His suit was so perfectly tailored it looked like it had been painted on. His shoes gleamed like mirrors, and the watch on his wrist caught the morning light like a tiny sun. But it wasn't his expensive clothing that made him stand out. It was his attitude, the way he surveyed the crowd like he owned not just the street he was standing on, but every person looking at him. There was something in his posture, in the set of his shoulders, that suggested he'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with his credit card. The crowd had already started to take notice. Whispers rippled through the gathering as people pointed and speculated about who this man might be. Some were pulling out phones, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. Sterling seemed to feed off the attention, his chest puffing out as he adjusted his tie and surveyed his audience. Standing directly in his path was one of the Queen's guards. I later learned his name was Corporal James Calloway, but in that moment he was simply the embodiment of everything the red uniform represented. 12 years of military service, including deployments to some of the world's most dangerous places, had shaped him into something unbreakable. He stood there in perfect stillness, his scarlet tunic pristine, his burskin hat casting shadows across weathered features that spoke of a man who'd seen more than most. His rifle was held with the casual confidence of someone who'd carried weapons in places where they meant the difference between life and death. Everything about his bearing suggested discipline, duty, and an unwavering commitment to something greater than himself. Sterling approached with the swagger of a man who'd never been told he couldn't have something. The crowd sensed the confrontation building and began to quiet down, conversations trailing off as people focused on the drama unfolding before them. "Good morning, my friend," Sterling announced, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone who'd grown up believing the world revolved around him. He reached into his jacket with theatrical flair and produced a crisp £100 note, holding it up like a prize. "I don't suppose you see many of these in your line of work, do you?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Even the tourists who didn't fully understand the protocols surrounding the Queen's Guard sensed that something inappropriate was happening. A few nervous laughs rippled through the gathering, but most people watched in uncomfortable silence. Calloway remained absolutely motionless. His eyes were fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd, beyond Sterling, beyond the immediate moment. His breathing was steady and controlled, his grip on his rifle unchanged. If he'd heard Sterling's words, he gave absolutely no indication of it. Sterling's confident smile flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself with renewed force. He waved the money closer to Calloway's face, near enough that the paper almost brushed his nose. "Come on now, soldier, just one little reaction. A blink, a smile, anything. This £100 could be yours." The crowd was growing larger now. Word was spreading through the usual morning throng that something was happening at the palace gates. More phones appeared, more cameras focused on the unfolding spectacle. Sterling noticed the expanding audience and seemed to draw energy from it, his voice growing louder and more theatrical. "Tell you what," he continued, reaching into his wallet and pulling out more bills. "Let's make this interesting. £500 just to scratch your nose. 1,000 to give me a smile. How about 10,000 if you'll take a quick photo?" With me, the crowd gasped. £10,000 was serious money. Months of salary for most people watching. A young mother pulled her child closer, trying to explain why the man was being so rude to the nice soldier. An elderly gentleman shook his head in obvious disgust. A group of tourists looked around in confusion, uncertain whether this was some kind of performance or genuine disrespect. But Calloway remained completely unmoved. Years of military discipline had taught him that external pressures, no matter how intense, were just noise. He'd stood guard through protests and celebrations, through rain and shine, through the mundane and the historic. A wealthy man having a public tantrum wasn't about to break his resolve. Sterling's face was beginning to show strain. The easy confidence that had carried him into this confrontation was starting to crack around the edges. He was a man accustomed to immediate results, to having obstacles removed and desires fulfilled with minimal effort. The guard's complete indifference to his offers was clearly more frustrating than he'd anticipated. He reached for his wallet again, this time making a show of counting out bills with exaggerated movements, ensuring everyone could see the growing pile of money in his hand. £20,000, he announced to the crowd. 20,000. Do you people understand what £20,000 means? A new car, a luxury vacation, a down payment on a house, all for 30 seconds of acknowledgement. The crowd was transfixed, but not in the way Sterling had hoped. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was something uglier, a display of arrogance and entitlement that made everyone uncomfortable. Here was a man who genuinely believed that every person had a price, that dignity and duty were just words that could be negotiated away. A small boy tugged at his mother's coat. "Mummy," he whispered, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "Why is that man being mean to the soldier?" The mother looked down at her son, then back at the scene playing out before them. She was dressed in the kind of practical clothes that suggested careful budgeting, probably saving for months for this family trip to London. Her expression showed the concern of a parent watching something that would shape her child's understanding of right and wrong. "Because some people think everything can be bought, sweetheart," she said softly, but loud enough for nearby spectators to hear. "But the soldier knows better. He knows some things aren't for sale." Sterling overheard her words and spun around, his face now noticeably flushed. "Oh, is that right?" He called out to the woman. "Everything has a price, darling. Absolutely. Everything. You just need to find the right number." The crowd's disapproval was becoming more vocal. People were starting to mutter their displeasure, but Sterling was nowhere near finished. He turned back to Calloway, the pile of money in his hand now substantial, enough to represent a small fortune to most observers. £50,000, he declared, his voice carrying a note of desperation barely disguised as confidence. 50,000, that's probably more than you make in 2 years. More money than you've ever seen in one place. All you have to do is acknowledge my existence." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the crowd was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Would the guard finally break? Would he take the money and abandon his post? Or would he continue this impossible display of discipline? Calloway didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even shift his weight. He stood there like a monument to something Sterling couldn't understand and clearly couldn't purchase. His stillness was so complete, so absolute, that it seemed to create its own gravity, drawing everyone's attention to the contrast between his calm and Sterling's growing agitation. Sterling's hand was trembling now, not from the weight of the money but from the weight of a lifetime of expectations crashing down around him. For the first time in his privileged existence, he was facing something that couldn't be solved with his bank account. That's when something extraordinary happened. Calloway moved. It was the slightest movement, barely perceptible to half the crowd. His eyes dropped, just once, to glance at the money scattered at his feet. Then, with movements so deliberate they seemed almost ceremonial, he bent down and picked up a single £100 note. Sterling's face lit up with triumph. "Finally," he exclaimed, "I knew you'd see reason. Everyone has their price, don't they? Even the Queen's Guard." But Calloway wasn't finished. With the same careful precision he'd used to pick up the bill, he tore it cleanly in half. The sound of ripping paper seemed to echo across the courtyard like thunder. The crowd erupted in a way that had nothing to do with celebration. It was a collective release of breath, a shared moment of recognition that something profound had just happened. Sterling's expression went from triumph to shock to something approaching fury in the space of heartbeats. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Sterling screamed, his composure finally and completely shattered. "That's real money. That's legal tender. You can't just destroy it." Calloway let the torn pieces flutter to the ground like fallen leaves. Then, for the first time since Sterling had approached him, he spoke. His voice was quiet, controlled, but it carried across the courtyard with the authority of someone who'd commanded respect in places where lives depended on it. "My oath isn't for sale, sir," he said. The word "sir" delivered with just enough edge to make it clear it was courtesy, not deference. "I'll need you to step back now." The crowd fell completely silent. Even the street noise seemed to fade away. Sterling stood there with his mouth open, staring at the torn money as if it represented a personal attack on everything he believed about the world. Then he laughed. It was a harsh, artificial sound that echoed strangely in the morning air. "Oh, you're good," he said, turning to address the crowd like a showman. "Very good. You want to play games? Let's play games then." He pulled out his phone, a gold-plated device that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His fingers flew across the screen, opening what appeared to be a banking application. £100,000, he announced, holding up the device so everyone could see the display. "I'll transfer £100,000 to whatever account you want right now, this instant. All you have to do is break character for 30 seconds. The crowd was stunned into silence. £100,000. It was an impossible sum for most people watching. Life-changing money. The kind of windfall that could solve every financial problem most families faced. But Calloway didn't even glance at the phone. His eyes remained fixed on that distant point, his breathing steady, his posture perfect. If Sterling's increasingly desperate offers had any effect on him whatsoever, it was completely invisible. Sterling's face was getting redder by the minute. The easy arrogance he'd displayed at the beginning was long gone, replaced by something raw and ugly. "Are you insane?" he shouted. "Are you completely out of your mind? It's £100,000. What's wrong with you?" An elderly man in the crowd stepped forward. He was clearly a veteran, wearing a faded military blazer with service ribbons on the chest. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of experience and hard-earned wisdom. "There's nothing wrong with him, son," the old man said, his words cutting through Sterling's rant like a blade. "He's doing exactly what he swore to do, what he's trained to do." Sterling whirled on the veteran, his face contorted with rage. "Oh, spare me the patriotic speeches, Grandad. This is the real world. Everyone has a price, everyone." The old soldier looked Sterling up and down with obvious contempt. "No, son, not everyone. Some things can't be bought, some things have to be earned." The crowd was beginning to voice its approval of the veteran's words. Sterling could feel the tide turning against him, could sense that his spectacle was becoming something he couldn't control. The entertainment value was wearing off, replaced by genuine disgust at his behavior. That's when he made his final, desperate gambit. £500,000, Sterling screamed, his voice cracking with strain. £500,000. You could buy houses, multiple houses, set your entire family up for generations. But the crowd was no longer just watching. They were participating, and definitely not in the way Sterling had intended. Voices began rising from different parts of the gathering, a chorus of disapproval that grew louder and more insistent. "Leave him alone," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "You're making a fool of yourself," called another voice. "Get lost, you absolute tosser," yelled a young woman near the front. Sterling was beyond hearing them now. He was trapped in his own bubble of disbelief, unable to process that his money, his power, his entire worldview was being rejected by a man who earned in a year what Sterling spent on a decent bottle of wine. He began pulling out everything he had on him. Credit cards, jewelry, even his expensive watch. "Look at this," he shouted, holding up a timepiece that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. "This watch is worth more than you'll make in a decade. I'll give you this, plus the money, plus anything else you want." The crowd was no longer just disapproving. They were actively hostile. What had started as morning entertainment had devolved into something uncomfortable, something that made everyone feel dirty for having witnessed it. Parents were steering their children away. Tourists were backing toward the street, and the locals were expressing their feelings in increasingly colorful language. Calloway remained completely unmoved. If anything, his bearing had become even more rigid, even more perfect. He was an immovable object against which Sterling's desperation was breaking like waves against granite. A group of teenagers near the front began chanting, "Piss off, piss off, piss off." The chant was quickly taken up by others, growing louder and more unified. Sterling spun around frantically, trying to identify the source. But the disapproval was everywhere now. "This is madness," he screamed over the noise. You're all completely mad. It's just a job. It's just a bloody uniform. That's when someone in the crowd threw something at him. Nothing dangerous, just a crumpled piece of paper, probably a discarded tourist brochure, but it hit him square in the chest. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone watching. Sterling staggered backward, looking around at the wall of hostile faces surrounding him. For the first time in his life, he seemed to realize that his money, his status, his entire identity meant absolutely nothing to these people. They didn't care about his net worth or his social position. They cared about what he was doing, and they despised him for it. More debris started flying. Nothing harmful, just street litter and discarded papers. But each piece carried the weight of collective rejection. Sterling's bodyguards, who had been standing by his car looking increasingly uncomfortable throughout the entire ordeal, finally moved into action. "Sir," one of them said, grabbing Sterling's arm firmly, "we need to leave, right now." Sterling tried to shake him off, but his fight was gone. He looked back at Calloway one final time, his face a mask of defeat and complete confusion. "This isn't finished," he muttered, though whether he was speaking to the guard or to himself was unclear. The bodyguards managed to hustle Sterling back to his car, though he continued shouting about peasants and fools and people who didn't understand the value of money. The Rolls-Royce pulled away from the curb with the same aggressive roar it had arrived with, but this time the sound carried desperation rather than arrogance. As the vehicle disappeared around the corner, the crowd slowly began to disperse. Some people lingered, still discussing what they'd witnessed, but most seemed eager to move on from the unpleasant spectacle. The morning's drama had left everyone feeling slightly soiled, as if they'd seen something they wished they could forget. But not everyone was ready to leave. A small group remained, positioned at a respectful distance from Calloway's post. They weren't trying to interact with him or get his attention. They were simply there, bearing witness to something important that had just happened. The elderly veteran was among them. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at Calloway with obvious respect and recognition. A few other men who appeared to have military backgrounds had joined him, forming an informal honor guard around the official one. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, approached slowly. He was carrying a small Union Jack, the kind sold at tourist shops throughout the city. He walked up to where the torn money still lay scattered on the pavement, carefully picked up the pieces, and placed them in a nearby rubbish bin. Then he stepped back and delivered a perfect salute. It was clearly a child's attempt, uncertain and imperfect, but it carried more dignity than anything Sterling had displayed that entire morning. Calloway's eyes didn't move from their fixed position, but something subtle changed in his expression, a slight softening around the eyes. Perhaps, or maybe it was just the way the morning light hit his face. The boy held his salute for a full 10 seconds, then lowered his arm and walked back to his parents. His mother was crying, not from sadness but from something else entirely. Pride, maybe, or hope for the future. As the minutes passed, more people began to approach the post, not to bother Calloway or try to get his attention, but simply to acknowledge what he represented. A businessman in an expensive suit placed a single flower at the base of the guard post. A group of university students stood in respectful silence for several minutes before moving on. An elderly woman, probably in her 80s, approached with the help of a walking stick. She didn't say anything to Calloway, didn't try to interact with him in any way, but she stood there for a long time, looking at him with an expression of profound gratitude. When she finally turned to leave, she whispered something that only those nearby could hear. "Thank you for your service." The morning sun was climbing higher now, burning away the autumn chill and casting new shadows across the palace grounds. The normal rhythm of tourist activity was slowly resuming, but there was something different about the atmosphere. People were more respectful, more aware of what they were actually looking at. The guards weren't just colorful tourist attractions anymore. They were symbols of something important, something that couldn't be bought or sold. I found myself staying much longer than I'd originally planned, fascinated by the aftermath of what I'd witnessed. The story was already writing itself in my mind, but I knew it was about much more than just one wealthy man's embarrassing morning. It was about values, about what we choose to honor and what we choose to reject as a society. Around midday, during the changing of the guard ceremony, I noticed something remarkable. The crowd was significantly larger than usual, and notably more attentive. Word of the morning's events had already begun to spread, and people wanted to see these soldiers who couldn't be bought. They watched the ceremony with a reverence that seemed deeper than normal, as if they were witnessing something sacred. Calloway was relieved by another guard during the ceremony, but he didn't leave the area immediately. He stood at perfect attention while his replacement took position, then executed a flawless about-face and marched toward the palace entrance. As he passed the exact spot where Sterling had scattered his money, he paused for just a moment. It was barely perceptible, but I caught it. Then he continued on his way, his bearing as perfect as ever, leaving behind a crowd that had learned something important about dignity, duty, and the things that truly matter in life. The story didn't end there, of course. In our hyper-connected digital age, nothing ever really ends. Within hours, videos of the entire confrontation were spreading across social media platforms at lightning speed. Someone had live-streamed the whole thing, and it was going viral faster than anyone could have predicted. The hashtag dignity not for sale was trending globally within hours. Memes featuring Sterling's increasingly red face contrasted with Calloway's stoic expression were being shared millions of times. But more importantly, the story had sparked a genuine conversation about values, about what we choose to honor in our society and what we choose to reject. Sterling's social media accounts were flooded with criticism and mockery. His business partnerships were being questioned by partners and clients. Several major corporations announced they were reviewing their relationships with his company. The man who had believed he could buy anything had learned that some things come with a price. He wasn't prepared to pay. Meanwhile, Calloway became an overnight sensation. Not that he would have wanted the attention or sought it out, but the public desperately needed someone to rally round. In an era of increasing cynicism about institutions and public service, he represented something pure and incorruptible. The royal household issued a brief statement later that day, commending the professionalism of their guards and noting that they served the crown with distinction, regardless of external pressures or distractions. The language was diplomatically neutral, but the message was crystal clear. They were immensely proud of their soldier. In the days that followed, the story took on a life of its own. News outlets around the world picked it up, not just as a curiosity or human interest piece, but as a symbol of something much larger. In a time when everything seemed to be for sale, when cynicism about public institutions was at an all-time high, here was a man who had stood absolutely firm in his duty, regardless of the potential consequences. Letters began arriving at Buckingham Palace from around the globe. Most were addressed simply to the guard who couldn't be bought or the soldier at the gate. They came from military veterans, from active service personnel, from ordinary citizens who wanted to express their admiration for what Calloway had done. Children sent hand-drawn pictures of soldiers standing guard. Elderly people wrote about family members who had served and how proud they were to see that tradition of honor continuing into the modern era. Young people wrote about how the story had completely changed their perception of what it means to serve something greater than yourself. Sterling, meanwhile, had retreated completely from public view. His company's stock price had taken a significant hit, and several major business deals had fallen through. More importantly, he had become persona non grata in the social circles that had once welcomed him with open arms. Wealth might open doors, but it couldn't erase the image of him screaming at a soldier who refused to be corrupted. I heard through various sources that Sterling had made multiple attempts to make amends, to somehow repair the catastrophic damage to his reputation. There were rumors of substantial charitable donations, of attempts to arrange meetings with military leaders, of high-powered public relations firms being hired to rehabilitate his image. But some things can't be fixed with money, and this was definitely one of them. The guard post at Buckingham Palace became something of an unofficial pilgrimage site, not in any formal capacity, but in the way that certain places become meaningful to people after significant events. Tourists would stand there a little longer, speak a little more quietly, and seem to genuinely understand that they were in the presence of something important. Calloway himself continued his duties exactly as if nothing had happened. He rotated through his regular shifts, performed his ceremonial duties, and maintained the same perfect military bearing he'd always displayed. If the massive amount of attention bothered him, he gave absolutely no sign of it. If he was proud of what he'd done, he kept that entirely to himself. That's the thing about true dignity, I realized as I reflected on what I'd witnessed. It doesn't seek recognition or reward. It doesn't need validation or applause. It simply exists, quietly and consistently, in the choices we make when we think no one is watching, in the principles we hold even when they cost us something significant. Months later, I had the opportunity to speak with some of Calloway's fellow guards. They were understandably reluctant to discuss the incident directly, maintaining the professional discretion that's an integral part of their training. But they painted a picture of a man who had always embodied the values he displayed that morning. James never made a big deal of it, one of them told me, speaking on strict condition of anonymity. To him, it was just another day at work. Someone tried to get him to break protocol, and he didn't. That's all it was to him. Nothing more, nothing less. But it was so much more than that. Of course, it was a powerful reminder that in a world where everything seems to be for sale, some things remain absolutely priceless. It was a demonstration that dignity isn't about what you possess, but about what you refuse to surrender. The story had international repercussions as well. Military leaders around the world cited the incident as a perfect example of the kind of professionalism and dedication they expected from their own forces. The video was incorporated into training programs, not as entertainment, but as a serious teaching tool about maintaining composure and integrity under extreme pressure. Sterling eventually returned to public life, though his reputation never fully recovered from that morning's debacle. He became noticeably more careful about his public statements, more conscious of how his actions might be perceived by others. Whether this represented genuine personal growth or simply better public relations management remained unclear, but the change in his behavior was undeniable. The incident also sparked much broader conversations about wealth inequality, about the relationship between money and power, about what we truly value as a society. Academic papers were written analyzing it from sociological perspectives. Political commentators used it as a lens through which to examine larger social issues, and it became a case study in business schools around the world. But perhaps the most important impact was on the countless individuals who witnessed it, either in person or through the viral video that spread across the globe. For many, it served as a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things simply by standing up for what they believe in. For others, it was a wake-up call about the corrosive effects of unchecked wealth and privilege. The torn £100 note, which had been discarded in a rubbish bin that morning, became a symbol in its own right. Someone had retrieved it, and it eventually found its way to a military museum where it was displayed alongside other artifacts of service and sacrifice. The placard beside it read simply, "Some things are not for sale," as I write this account. Years after that transformative morning outside Buckingham Palace, the story continues to resonate with people around the world. It's been told and retold countless times, each telling emphasizing different aspects of what transpired. Some versions focus on Sterling's spectacular comeuppance, others on Calloway's unwavering dignity, still others on the crowd's collective reaction to what they witnessed. But for me, the most important element of the story is what it revealed about the fundamental choices we all make and the values we choose to hold dear. In a single moment of crisis, two men revealed exactly who they really were at their core. One chose to use his vast wealth as a weapon, trying to force another human being to compromise their principles. The other chose to stand absolutely firm in his convictions, regardless of the potential cost. That morning had started like any other, with tourists and locals going about their daily routines, snapping photos and consulting guidebooks. But it ended with everyone who was there understanding something profound about human nature, about the crucial difference between price and value, about the things that truly matter in this world. Calloway retired from the Queen's Guard a few years later. Though he remained in military service in other capacities, he never gave interviews about the incident, never attempted to capitalize on his moment of global fame. He simply continued to serve his country quietly and with dignity, exactly the way he always had. Sterling's business empire continued to flourish financially, though he never again achieved the level of social acceptance he'd once enjoyed. He learned to be more cautious about his public behavior, but whether he truly understood the deeper lesson of that morning remained questionable. The guard post at Buckingham Palace remains fundamentally unchanged, a symbol of continuity and tradition in an ever-changing world. New guards take their positions there every day, carrying on the same sacred duties that Calloway performed, holding themselves to the same exacting standards he embodied. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the autumn air has that particular bite that makes you appreciate simple warmth, I find myself walking past that exact spot and remembering what I witnessed there. The day when unlimited money met unshakable principle, when privilege encountered true dignity, when a billionaire learned that some things genuinely cannot be bought at any price. The lesson of that morning wasn't complicated or theoretical. It wasn't about politics or economics or abstract social theory. It was about something much simpler and infinitely more profound, the idea that we all have fundamental choices to make about who we want to be, and that those choices define us, far more than any amount of wealth or status ever could. In the end, Max Sterling III had everything money could possibly buy, but he discovered that morning that it couldn't purchase the one thing he desperately needed: genuine respect. And Corporal James Calloway, who had nothing but his uniform and his sacred oath, possessed something that no amount of money could ever purchase: unshakable dignity. That's the complete story of the morning when a billionaire thought he could buy the Royal Guard and discovered that his ego was no match for true character. But more than that, it's a story about the things that matter most in this world, and the quiet courage it takes to stand up for them when it would be so much easier to simply give in and look the other way. The legacy of that morning continues to inspire people around the globe, a reminder that some things remain priceless in a world where everything seems to have a price tag. And that's a lesson worth remembering, no matter who you are or what you possess.